Okay, morning. Again, my name is Tim Ahrens. I'm on Amazon. I have published 3 books so far. The first one is The Salvation of Tanglagel. That is a story, a book of 13 short stories wrapped together with a central theme. So it means all those stories are pulled together by one story that wraps itself all the way down through the center and then ends. Second one and third one are the Dark Creature series. The first one is A Simple Game. And the second one is The Grand Game. There's a third one in production, but at the moment, it's going to be kind of slow coming out. If you're interested in the genre, it is dark fantasy, which means that it's fantasy and horror mixed together. That would be Stephen King meets Lord of the Rings is a good way to put it. It's also got kind of like a 3-level 3D chess feel to it. So you're dealing with gods that no one prays to anymore, who are playing with human lives in this reality, who are playing with lives in a fantasy reality. So I'll talk a little bit about how I got self-published first. I started writing back when I was 15 years old, and trust me, that stuff is hidden. If you want to be a writer, I always suggest that you practice. You got to find your own voice, and do a lot of reading too, because that'll give you an idea of what type of writer you want to be. Most writers, when they do start writing, usually imitate their people that they like to read most, like Pierce Anthony or Stephen King for good points. But eventually you will develop your own voice, which is what you really need to sell books. Another good example is I would never follow the crowd. A good example would be when 7 Shades of Grey came out. 75% of the authors who are self-published suddenly went to erotic fiction. That's not going to help you. My advice to any new writers would be to find your genre, find your voice, write what you love. And if you do that, and you write well enough, and you scream loud enough, people actually might notice you. It's always a good way to get started. You should always have a large imagination, and then figure out what type of how do we put this? Like type of avenue you want to go to get published. That's another thing that takes a lot of research. So I recommend that if you decide you want to do something like that, you dig into it, because there are a lot of shills out there who will take your money and not do you any good at all. There are also a lot of reputable companies out there, which is why I said I suggest you look into it. You can go the traditional route, which is going to a big publishing company and take your chances. There's nothing wrong with that. You'll be competing against 3 million people to 6 million people. It's the same thing with self-publishing, though, except that you might have a leg up as far as who you know and where you advertise. Writing the book is not the hard part. Getting the book published these days is not the hard part. Advertising is the hard part. That's to let people know that your book is out there, what it's about, and that they want to read it. The more people you get to realize that they want to read your book, the better off you are. That's the hard part. I've been writing for a good long time. As I said, I've got 3 books published on Amazon currently. That's my biggest problem, and almost any other writer's biggest problem that they'll tell you about is advertising, is getting their books out. In most cases, you want to try to be, when you're writing a book, you want to try to be as individualistic as possible. Best way to do that is to make your premise, my personal opinion, make your premise of your book, put everything into your characters. Characters are what's going to drive that book. There are a lot of people out there who love to read Tolkien and stuff like that and think that he is a great author, but he's very long-winded in some sections. If you've ever read Lord of the Rings or any of this stuff, I don't think that these days anyway, that your audience has enough patience to read a whole chapter on Mirkwood Forest when you're only going to spend 10 pages there. You should also try to let your readers see through the eyes of the characters that you're writing about. Let your characters pull your readers through the story. Make sure that they can step inside their skin and walk around in it a little bit. So if your characters are scared or nervous about a situation, so should your readers be. If they're looking at a situation that's shocking, your readers should also be shocked. depending on what you're writing. Fantasy is more of an imaginative than horror is, which means that you got to try harder to make your characters believable. If you're reading, I read a book just another day, I won't divulge the title, but I did read a book just the other day that I got about halfway through and shut because it was ridiculous. The premise was really good, characters were nice, but the side characters were interacting with the main character were ridiculous. Right down to where one father who was giving his daughter away to somebody he only met yesterday was going, yeah. No, it doesn't work that way. Needless to say, so if you had any questions, I'll take that at the end of the speech, I guess you can call it, for self-publishing or what I do to self-publish. Since I don't go through traditional publishers, the cheapest way to do that is to go through Amazon. But if you do Amazon publishing, make sure you have all your P's and Q's set. You want to make sure all your spelling's correct, punctuation's correct. You don't want people correcting you as they're reading your books. If you want to go through another self-publishing book route and go through Atmosphere, which is what I do, or several of the other major companies that are out there to do that, make sure they provide you with the services that you want for your book. That you're not paying for stuff that you don't use or you won't use. A lot of them, again, Atmosphere is a good example, will ask you what you want them to do for you. So if you have a good editor outside of Atmosphere, then you can say, I don't need you to edit my book. Take the money that you would have put to that editor and off the amount of money that you're charging me for. Another good thing I would recommend is get a good visual artist. I have somebody I had through Eau Claire. He did all my maps in black and white. Let's see, pardon me for the moment. Should have had these marked. He did all my character drawings. Anything you can do that's visual for your book is a plus. If you're working on ebooks and books, I recommend that when you decide to self-publish, even with Amazon, try to make sure that you get them in a package. Like you say, I want to publish my book, but I want an ebook with it. How much would it cost, or is it the same amount if I just get an ebook and a regular book published? Atmosphere, for instance, last time I dealt with them, said that, yeah, we'll give you an ebook free if you publish with us for the regular books. If you want a hardcover with your book, there's a lot to think about. If you want a hardcover with your book, that's going to be more expensive, but then again, it'll also give you avenues that you won't have with just soft covers. For instance, Barnes & Noble might put a couple of your books on their shelves in their bookstore because you have a hardcover over softcover. I did get my first book into Barnes & Noble, at least 2 or 3 copies, because I had a hardcover. And when I talked to the manager there, he was willing to sneak it in there. So there's a lot of them that will help local authors if you have a hardcover. But then again, as I said, hardcovers are more expensive. Dealing with my own books, the first one is The Salvation of Tangled Bells. I said it's a collection of short stories, so I moved a lot of the characters from that first work into my other 2 works. So you can read Dark Creatures, A Simple Game, and The Grand Game, which is the second book in the series, without having to read the first book. But you're going to notice that there might be some backstory that you really want to know about that you don't know about, which might prompt you to buy the first book. But anyway, The Simple Game starts with 2 major characters. The first one is Doug Pimpkin, and the second one is William Donovan. Doug Pimpkin is a wannabe serial killer. Just so you're aware, that's what dark fantasy comes from. And to put him together, I did a lot of research on serial killers. So you're going to see some Ted Bundy in Doug. You're going to see some Ed Gein in Doug. And you're also going to see some John William Gacy. Disgusting people. Doug actually gets drawn into Dark Creatures because he's on the dark web. He likes to play games on the dark web, and he likes to visit sites on the dark web. And that's where he gets drawn into the game of Dark Creatures. Who's running the original game of Dark Creatures? Well, that would be gods that no longer have a purpose in reality. So if you're dealing with the Christian God or the Christian devil or Islam or anything like that, I don't deal with those. I deal with gods that people have pretty much forgotten and quit praying with. So that's the Roman gods, it's the Greek gods. I even entered in a couple of gods from H.P. Lovecraft. These gods have formed a society called Dark Creatures. It's a game. They have to do this because they've been pushed aside from reality. They don't have any point anymore. But you can't get rid of them because they're gods. So their powers have been reduced, but they can still make trouble, all sorts of trouble. So what they do is they've centered all their powers down into one game. And each god takes their turn at the board playing these games with people with human lives. Good versus evil, usually. It's the simplest way to do it. Whoever wins, wins, and whoever loses, loses. Which isn't good for gods, they don't want to lose. So in the beginning of the book, you start out with Janus. Now, most people think of Janus as a two-faced god in Roman mythology. Past, present, future is what their job is to look into. I decided to split them into two different groups. So my Janus has got a female version and a male version. Brother and sister. They fight each other on the game board. So when you're introduced to them, you'll notice that they are in sync with each other completely. When one smiles, the other smiles. When one frowns, the other frowns. They have decided to choose two random players in a town called Milton. Milton is just outside of Madison, Wisconsin, which is where Middleton is located now. Originally, if you look at the book, follow the book, that was Milton. But because of situations that happened throughout the series, we had to get rid of Milton. So we just changed reality into Middleton. So these two gods have decided to pick their playing pieces. And then in order to get their playing pieces more involved in the game that they've got going, they created a 9-bit game called Dark Creatures that they could introduce to those two players. Those two players, which is Doug Pimpkin and William, God, my brain's freezing up here, Donovan, I think they're playing just a simple 9-bit video game. What they're actually doing is controlling lives that they've created in the world of Dark Creatures with a completely different dimension and a completely different world. So if you're dealing with a world called Dark Creatures, you can assume that everything in your nightmares or anything in dark fantasy or anything like that that appears can appear in the world of Dark Creatures. So the two characters in the fantasy world are Augury Paris and Trevelyan and Lilica Trevelyan. One is a succubus and the other one is a wraith. They're anti-heroes. They do the right thing for the completely wrong reason. So that's what they do, is they're going through their world thinking that they're living their life independently when they're being controlled by the two humans who are being controlled by the two gods. Unfortunately, according to this book, things kind of fly out of control because other gods are starting to interfere with a simple game. They're starting to try to stir things up, play things around, break the rules. So that's where the grand game comes in. When things get out of control, then you have to come up with a larger game to contain the game that had gotten out of control and rework everything back to where people won't notice it. So they've come up with a grand game, which means they brought in 3 more gods to control 3 more characters to try to wrap this thing back up in a nice little ball. The last time they had a simple game go out of control from a grand game is a little place called Roanoke. If you don't know what Roanoke, Virginia is, I highly recommend you look into it. It's one of the biggest mysteries out there right now in history. You had an entire, I think it's an entire village of English settlers. I can't remember the exact date. I think it was the 1800s, but I'm not entirely sure of the date, sorry. Disappear. Well, there's a reason for that. It's because a game went out of control and the guys had to cover it all up. So, you have these 5 other gods in the grand game who are now trying to contain whatever mischief other gods are playing in the original game. So now you have a bubble that Milton's been put into that's slowly degrading into something darker and more horrible. So now William and Doug both have to contend with their hatred for one another while still contending with the world slowly dissolving around them. It gets to be a pretty deep, involved plot line. But if you like dark fantasy and you like character creation, I highly recommend it. It's one of the most in-depth stuff I've written. I did a lot of research on poor Doug. William is just your average teenager who gets caught up in a place where he really shouldn't have been. The other three gods contact other humans who are still in the area where Dark Creatures was originally being played and lure them into the game, so they have to create their own characters, but they still think they're just playing a game. They don't realize this is an actual reality until close to the end of the book. As I said, I have a third one going as to what happens after that, but unfortunately, I'm not going to write that for a little bit. Okay, any questions so far? No? Okay. Let's see. So as I said, I've been writing for a good 40 years. It started in 15. I've always been interested in fantasy and science fiction, although what really got me into writing was Twilight Zone. The black and white series, not the new color ones. If anyone has any problem with black and white, I really suggest they put it aside for the series because there's fantastic writing in the original black and white. It's not preachy. Serling did a fantastic job with all of his short story episodes. Each character is defined. If you want a good example of how to create a character and follow it through, watch Twilight Zone. In a half an hour episode, Serling creates a setup, he shows you the character, he walks you through the setup, and he allows you to follow that character to the end, and sometimes you won't expect where the end goes. Hello, you can come in if you like. It's a beautiful series. I highly recommend it. It's what started me into wanting to write. And then, of course, I moved through a bunch of other series like Tales from the Dark Side. Highly recommend that one. That one's funner. That's more newer, so it's in color. Let's see. And then I moved in through Stephen King. I read a lot of books on his early stuff. H.P. Lovecraft is another great author that you should look into, although his writing is a little dated as far as the sound of it when you're reading it time-wise, but he is actually a very, very fantastic horror writer if you're into horror. My first book actually got endorsed by Pierce Anthony. If you've ever read anything from Pierce Anthony, he's a fantastic fantasy writer. I highly recommend him too. He wrote The Blue Adapt. He wrote the Misadventure series. He wrote a whole bunch of stuff. I think he's still popular nowadays, although his name's not quite as well known. I started to get published through a friend of mine who recommended that we send both our works into magazines. So we both wrote short stories together and then sent them in as a duo. So that's a good way if you want a little extra support and you're writing short stories, you want to try to publish them, is find somebody who wants to write that short story with you so you can come up with characters together and then build the world with somebody else that way. It's a lot easier than trying to come up with yourself originally. My first short story was Winteries. That was with Neil Reeby. We published that in Rising Sun magazine, which is defunct now, unfortunately. And that was about I think Massachusetts town who wanted to move their graveyard so they could build condominiums. Problem is that the residents of the graveyard didn't want to be moved. So he called in an exorcist in order to drive out the spirits of the graveyard, and the exorcist found out that he was driven out himself. We wrote quite two or three of short stories that got published that way through other magazines. Darksider magazine was one. I forget what the third one we got published through was. But at least we got it was a very small amount of money, but hey, it was exciting to get published the first time. Then we went our separate ways to write our own work, and I started on The Salvation of Tangle and lucky for me, a friend of mine in Texas was opening her own publishing business. So I actually got a leg up on that because self-publishing is, if it's nothing else, it's expensive. So she cut me a great deal with my first book and my second book, which was this one. And her husband did all the 3D artwork on the cover, which is why it's a wraparound. The third book, since my friend in Texas couldn't make a go of it and had to close up shop, I had to go through Atmosphere, who is also a great company. They edited my book. They set my type centers, the font I was using. They helped me set up where all the artwork was going to go into the book. They had 2 or 3 proofreaders read it for me. Once again, it did cost me quite a bit of money. But it was well worth the service because they also helped me advertise it in the end. So I actually ended up selling a lot more books than I did for a simple game because I had somebody who was advertising on the web, along with Amazon. I advertised through them. I advertised through Barnes & Noble. I advertised everywhere. Let's see. What else would there be? After that, I suppose another series I should recommend would be Night Gallery. If you've never heard of it, recommend you look into it. It's a 70s show, late 70s, late 70s. That one is a horror series set up with paintings, and it's also hosted by Rod Serling before he passed away in 75, I believe is when he passed away. There are a lot of other good authors out there that can teach you how to write a book or how to create a character. How to create a character, to me, is simple because I started by role-playing. So when I started to create my characters, I started with Dungeons & Dragons. Easiest way to do it, get a bunch of friends together and play the game. It's the easiest way to do it. Always, when starting a character, start from the ground up. First, you want to know what they look like. Then you want to know what their genre is, what their gender is, what their genre is, how they think right down to the ground. So you should probably be able, by the time you're ready to write your book, to figure out what your character would do or think in almost any given situation. Yeah, I know it sounds hard, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. It gets so easy, in fact, that when I was writing the Grand Game, I was arguing with my characters because some of them didn't, oh, no, we wouldn't do this, we'd do this. It sounds a little ludicrous, but it happens. The easiest way to do that, as I said, is to know, first of all, what genre you want to write in. Do you want to write fantasy? Do you want to write horror? Do you want science fiction? Do you want to write contemporary, historical? Some sections of writing or areas of writing are easier to write than others. A lot of writers will tell you that historical is really easier to write because you already have all the background set up for you. You want to write Revolutionary War, you got tons of books you can look into Revolutionary War. So same thing with Civil War, the Napoleonic Wars, all of that, very simple to set up a background for because you have it all written out for you already. If you want to write pure fantasy, then you've got to come up with your own stuff, and you got to make sure that you stay far enough away from other fantasy writers that they can't come at you and say, well, no, you stole this from me, while still making your own. Now, there's a lot of public domain out there that you can use. Elves are public domain these days. Dwarves are public domain. Everybody writes about those nowadays. Anything you want to write as far as H.P. Lovecraft that was written in the 1900s, anything like that is public domain. Do a little research. That way no one's going to come knocking on your door with a slip. I always was worried about that first when I started writing too. I'm not going to get knocked down the door by a lawyer or anything. Especially when a friend of mine and I were doing a couple of short stories we were selling to magazines about H.P. Lovecraft because we were taking some of his characters and then we were reworking new stories using those characters, like some of the characters from the Mountains of Madness. Let's see, I'm trying to think what the other name of that one was that was Lovecraft. Oh, shoot, my mind's gone blank, I apologize. But we did write a couple of his characters, and there were a couple of magazine people who would love to pick those up. My friend was more worried about copyright infringement than I was, but we looked into it, and yeah, it was all public domain. He's all way, way past the public domain thing. The only time you have to worry about public domain not being public domain is to make sure that the people who originally came up with the work didn't re-up the copyrights for it. The Family, for instance. John Carter, the movie that came out for that, I'm trying to think of the author of that. It doesn't come to my mind either, which is unfortunate. His family re-upped all the copyrights to that. So if you want to write something about John Carter or Mars, the Mars series or anything like that he wrote, you would have to go through his family for an okay before you can publish it. Otherwise, they can come back and go, we want money for that. That's not to say that you can't use his setup. You can. You just can't use his characters. If you like Stephen King's Deary situation, which when he wrote it, he had no idea he was going to make Deary into a complete series. In fact, he had no idea that it was going to take off for that matter. It took him like 3 years to write that book. And they still ended up changing the ending, so if anyone has read it, the original book, you'll understand why they changed the ending. It's a little provocative, and I'm probably not going to, since other people will be watching this of younger ages, I'm not going to go into why it's provocative. But you can say, so for instance, take a small town like Stephen King did and make it your own and then change the name. That's easy enough to do. It's the same thing with H.P. Lovecraft. All he did when he made his world is walk around his neighborhood. He looked at the buildings, he looked at the atmosphere, he got a feel for what was going on, and then he wrote what he saw. That is one of the best ways to get a good background on your characters, is to write what you see. If you want to start out, for instance, in a desolate place, go to a deserted park. Or go to the E-Way, for instance, the Madison E-Way, which wasn't too far away. Walk around there for half an hour. There's not a whole lot of people in the area. That'll spur your imagination as to where you want to start your character in that setup. Same thing with if you want to do an industrial short story, walk around Madison. Walk around Broome Street, some of the other streets up in there. That'll give you great ideas on what your area should look like. If you want to write science fiction, then you have to go online. But I do recommend deviantart.com. There's a lot of artists there that give out free artwork. They show free artwork to advertise their own abilities. You'll get a lot of ideas for space age startings and beginnings and areas in which you can start from. And those artists aren't going to complain because it's all free for them. As I said, once you have your idea down as to what you want to do, make sure you have your character down 100%. And what I mean by that is that your main character is good, but you should also have enough side characters to populate your world. It's not always so much interesting to some readers, especially a fantasy, not so much science fiction, but especially fantasy. They're not so much interested in only following a main character, but how they interact with other characters. A good example of that would be Conan the Barbarian. If you go back and you read some of those old books, or some of the other old books that you might find in Arrow or something like that was written in the 60s, you'll find that although Conan is the main character, everybody he interacts with hypes the story, raises the story. You like Conan more because of the way he interacts with other people, the way he talks to other people, or his reaction to other people's decisions. I would recommend that wholeheartedly because when I wrote my books, I made sure I did put enough side characters in there to interest people, is to figure out what makes this other person tick without having to go into 4 chapters of why this person opposes this idea. Let's see. World building is important. I'm sorry. World building is important. So make sure you have a nice round one, but don't go, I know I'm putting out a lot of stuff here, and I do apologize if I'm confusing anybody. Don't go so far into that world that you can't make alterations while you're writing. A good example of that is Tolkien wrote an entire chapter on Mirkwood Forest to the point where if at some point, which he didn't, but at some point, if you wanted to change aspects of Mirkwood Forest later on in books, he couldn't. He's stuck. I would always recommend that you write a snapshot of where your characters are, what's going on around them, the atmosphere of the area in which they're in. Reputation is always good, and how they think of it really quickly, or what other people think about it and how they're making a decision based off of what he's thinking about it. But don't go so far as to make it black and white, because if you do that, you're frozen, you're stuck. Whereas, if you want to, say, start with a haunted forest and then make it darker for other reasons, that might not work with your original setup for your haunted forest. Because then people will go back and wait. In chapter 6, you said this, and now in chapter 8, you're doing... Yeah, you want to stay consistent. You want to try to stay as consistent as possible, because there are people out there who don't read for enjoyment. They read for specifics. Always keep in mind of the suspension of disbelief. Hard to do in fantasy, hard to do in dark fantasy. But if you can pull people far enough into the book, suspension of disbelief will no longer matter. It won't be that they can't believe that the situation is happening. They'll be thinking of what's going to happen to this guy next. That's what you want. You want that interest to pull people in. Any other questions for anything about that at all? Any questions on publishing at all? No? Okay. This is a pretty quiet group. Does anybody have any questions about other means in publishing besides self-publishing and traditional publishing? Well, there are other avenues you can try to start with. They're also a little more difficult than self-publishing, but they'll give you a name. Comic books, you can try getting into DC or Marvel. That's always a possibility. Once again, it takes you the ability to build your character and the world, because the publishing people in those genres are looking for individualism. If you can get a comic book company to accept your character, you've got an automatic advertising route, because now you have a name. You've published with DC. You've published with Marvel. If you can get your short stories, which is also important, you get your short stories in some major magazines like Ellery Queen. Amazing Stories, I think, is still out there. I can't remember a couple other smaller publishers. Look into it on the web. If you can get a short story into that, you can say that you were published with a major magazine. That's also another big pull to editors and people who want to publish this stuff. And those are actually much easier to get into than trying to shoot a whole book at a regular traditional publisher. And it's not going to cost you anything but paper. If you can get yourself a background like that, that'll give you a foot up in actually starting to publish your first book. It'll also get people interested on higher upper scales of other publishing companies to say, hey, you've been published 6 or 7 times in this and this and this and this. It gives you a track record. I would always recommend, though, that you try to write your own stuff. I would never recommend that you try to copy other people's style or other people's work. There's a million people out there writing Stephen King. There's a million, I know I use him a lot, but he's well known. And now there's a million people trying to write H.P. Lovecraft. There's a million people out there trying to write Pierce Anthony. Don't write another writer. You can read another writer, get ideas on how they set up their world and what they do. Always write what you want to write about. Always write your characters, because that's where the fun is. If you don't write your own characters and you try to mash your characters into other situations, you're going to get bored real quick, and you're not going to finish that book. Another thing is that most people, I know a lot of writers love to write detailed outlines on what happens in their books. I'm the type of guy who writes books by the seat of his pants. I know the beginning of the book, I know the middle of the book, I know the end of the book. That's all I need to know. I'll start writing the beginning of the book, and I'll let that book write itself all the way down to, wait, I have to get to this point. I get to the middle of the book, and then I have to get to the end now. So I'll just let the book flow. That way I'm not so rigid. I mean, there's a lot of people who do need that stuff, and that's fine. If you can't keep a book organized enough in your head that you need an outline, by all means, there's nothing wrong with writing outlines. They're very helpful for millions of people. I've always found them restricting, especially if I'm in the middle of chapter 6. And I'm like, oh, wait, this character can go this way, but it's not part of my outline. Well, I'll read them in the other book. Well, then, of course, you forget about them or it doesn't work or something like that. I like to just say, as I'm writing along going, hey, this could actually happen over here. Well, that does happen over here. Then we'll move this back over here. It's just more fun for me. I find that I'll finish a book faster and have a lot more fun if I don't over-imagine it, over-set it up. I just like to leave leeways where I can follow another train of thought if the situation occurs. I guess that would be about all of my time for today, yes? Pretty close?
You've got till 1:45.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, let's see. Well, I can describe to you a little bit about the world of dark creatures, then, which is the fantasy world I designed. You ever have a nightmare? Ever have a monster in that nightmare? That's where you'll find in dark creatures. There's anything and everything that's dark, nightmarish, horrible to think about, unhappy, vicious, evil. There are three types of things in the world of dark creatures, which is a medieval world. It's a world that runs on death, destruction, and pretty much the act of survival. If you can survive in dark creatures, you can survive anywhere. The three different things are there is the human race, which is pretty much all the way down to the 14th, 15th century of living. You've got anti-heroes, which either decide to help or decide to hurt the human population. And then you've got the outright monsters who don't care. They control everything for the most part right now, from behind the scenes. So if you think that there's a city in both these books called Tanglagel, which is the worst possible walled city you can possibly think of, it has slavery. It enjoys slavery. It buys and sells people by the dozen. It buys and sells people to monsters. It buys and sells kids to monsters who use them as food. And then you have the anti-heroes who either go along with this or end up fighting it. Now, my two anti-heroes in these two books at the moment are more like mercenaries. They have their own moral code, but it's not what you would call a human moral code. They don't support justice or running to help the selfless. No, you pay them, they'll do the job. And their backstories are all written up perfectly in this book, so you understand how they became a wraith and how they became a succubus. My succubus doesn't feed off of the love, the emotional love of men or something like that. She eats hearts. That's how she feeds herself. So what she does is that she takes on the guise of a human minstrel, and then when she needs to feed, she becomes her succubus form. My wraith, which is Augury Parse, she lives in her sword. Wherever her sword goes, that's where she goes. Her entire makeup is an illusion, which means that the sword floats on nothing, but you see a woman carrying it. If you try to strike her, your sword will pass right through her because she's not real in that sense. But if she wants to attack, she can change herself into different forms. Like in one particular scene, 3 guards decide they're going to take her money and everything else she owns, to which case she traps them, turns into dung beetles, and eats them from the inside out. She can defend herself very, very well if she needs to. Both of these people are mercenaries. They work together. Why they work together? Well, that's something you're going to have to figure out yourselves. But they get themselves into all sorts of trouble because Doug and William put them in that situation. As far as those two, as far as the Wraith and the succubus know, Doug and William are their god. They tell them what to do and where to go when they set up their situations. The whole world itself is not run by humans. It's just these two characters working and living within this world. So as I said, if you want to think about what makes the world of dark creatures run, think of any horror imagination you can think of, and it lives in that world. It attacks, it lives. You can even create your own if you want. If you want. I've got a couple of, they're not D&D characters, but they're based off of D&D monsters that live primarily just to eat and survive in this world. And then, of course, there are heroes. Of course, people try to save other people here and there. But those heroes are few and far between because in a world that dark, light doesn't shine very brightly. And a bright light like that won't last very long. So if you're not an anti-hero in the world of dark creatures and you think of yourself as a hero, you've got a lot of work to do. Needless to say, though, I am very happy that everybody who showed up showed up. Thank you very much for appearing at my, my conference. As I said, if you're interested in dark creatures or the Salvation of Tanglegal, you can find me on Amazon. I'm also on Barnes & Noble. I'm also on all sorts of other websites in there for publishing. I am published on demand, so if you decide to order it, please do. It'll print on demand for you, and it'll be sent there probably within 2 or 3 days. The good aspects about the book, besides the plot line and everything, is, as I said, it's got full artwork and all the maps for all the places within the book. And I also took a tip from J.R. Tolkien at one point when I wrote this one, and I wrote this one. It actually has songs in it, too. That would be about it for me, I think. Does anyone else have any other questions? Yes?
I was just wondering, because you seem like really passionate about the world and the characters you made, and I was just wondering how you separate that from it being like a job.
Oh, that's a good idea. See, that ties right back to me telling you to write what you enjoy. If you're trying to copy another writer, it's a job. You're trying. If I were to go and write a horror novel based off of Deary, or based off of what Stephen King wrote, that would be a job for me, because I'm looking at what he wrote, how he wrote it, how he signed, how he set it all up, what his characters are, and I got to use all these characters in my own work, which may not work in this work, so I got to figure out how to do that and this. I enjoy my work because I set up my own stuff. I set up my own characters. I set up my own world. I write what I love. If you do that, you'll enjoy every minute of it. You'll be running around going, oh, man, my characters are going to do this. And then, he's a jerk, so he's going to run over and do this. I'm saying it simplistically, of course, because it gets much more involved while you're writing it. If you really love your characters, you'll start seeing them act in your mind as you're writing them and what they do. I recommend that if you do that, you write down everything you see. If your character's sneaking around like this, I recommend that you say he's hunched over and he's quietly doing this. Give the reader as much detail without going into, let me explain exactly how this guy looks. I'm passionate about my writing and my world because I write what I like. I write what I love. I write dark fantasy, and horror. That's what I love to do. I love to mix fantasy with horror because no one does that very much, and it's very fun to see how far you can go with it without making people, as one person would say, without going to the gross out. There are some, as I said, there are some scenes that are questionable for anybody who is under the age of 14, 13 or 14. I recommend, because dark fantasy can get violent, and my serial killer does get violent. He ends up being called the corpse collector. But as far as writing, then, as I said, first create your character, see what genre you want to write in, what makes you happy. Do you like to write about desolate places? Do you like to write about populated places? Do you like science fiction or fantasy? Whatever genre you want to write in, there's a million ways to do it. Make sure you write what you love, and you'll never find that a day of work, as if you put a day of work in. In fact, you'll be excited to sit down after work going, oh, I got to write this other chapter out because I was at work and I was just thinking about this. And I got to get it down before. That's how much passion. That's why I'm so passionate about my stuff. Thanks again for coming. I definitely appreciate all of your time, and I hope I could have been some help with you.